All right. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Steve, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for getting out of the breakfast queue in time for the keynote. So I've spoken at some Agile events before. I apologize for whatever I said then. Steve, when he invited me, said, you usually are a bit of a downer talking about nihilism and technology. Can you be more optimistic this year? So I'm going to try. Ambiguity is as optimistic as I can get. So we'll see how that works. And yes, I will take questions after if there's time. I think there should be time. All right. Will this advance? No. Yes. All right. But of course, I can't ever give a talk without giving some background on my work in nihilism and technology. So just bear with me while you enjoy your coffee and some nihilism. So you're probably familiar with everyday technologies like the Roomba, which of course gives you the promise of the couch fort family experience you've always wanted. The only downside, of course, is that the data it has to collect to give you this couch fort possibilities can also be sold to advertisers to invade your privacy. You've probably seen at your local electronics shop some sort of drone Christmas opportunities, what Black Friday would be complete without getting a drone for your child. Of course, they can also be used by militaries for weapon purposes. And of course, you're probably all familiar with crowdfunding and similar possibilities like Airbnb, Uber, Kickstarter, GoFundMe, which in the United States we call our healthcare system. And again, the idea that these give you opportunities to monetize parts of your life you never realized you could monetize before. What a fantasy, what a dream. But of course, they also allow you to exercise all the biases, sexism, racism, xenophobia you could ever want. And of course, we're probably all familiar with this guy. A humble, lowly Harvard student who just wanted to be able to judge women on campus as hot or not. And, little things got out of hand, and he's destroying democracy. The usual. So, what does all this mean? Well, this means that importantly, we can't think about technology the way we have traditionally. We can't think about it as just an object that does what you tell it to do, that humans act and objects obey. Instead, we have to be a little bit more philosophical about this. I'm going to throw at you some difficult concepts for just waking up, but bear with me. So the idea in this really ugly philosophical word we've invented, post-phenomenology, I won't say it again, is this idea that actually subjects and objects don't exist independently of each other, that actually I am what I am through the things that I'm using, like this microphone, like my glasses, like my clothes, and this would also apply to all of you. But retroactively, reversibly, this also applies to technologies, that they are what they are through us. So again, even something like the humble fork, you might think, oh, I know what that is. I tell my child every morning at breakfast, you're not using the fork properly, but that's dad me. And then I go back to philosopher me, and I say, I'm very proud of you for answering the call of the being of the fork. Because again, it's this idea that a fork can be all of these things. It can be a utensil at a meal. It can be an art object. It can be a murder weapon. And the other side of that, of course, is that also turns you into an eater, an artist, or a murderer. So the problem with this notion of multi-stability, the problem with this idea that technologies could actually be multiple things, is that means that we cannot predict in advance how anyone will relate to any particular technology. And as I tried to explain in my book, this leads us to the danger of nihilism, to the idea that, well, if I can't predict how people are going to use a technology, then how could I ever be ethical? To make normative claims requires, if I'm going to say how things ought to be used, that I have some sense of how it will be used. But if I can't make predictions, then I can't be held accountable, which of course also means I cannot be held responsible. So this leads us into this idea. I don't think this applies to anyone in this room, of course, but other designers in other conferences might think, well, it's up to users to determine if a product is ethical or not. That's not my job. But of course, the user is sitting there thinking the same thing about all of you. Sorry, not you, other people, other conference. And the result of this, as I detail in my book, is these 5 different kinds of nihilistic technologies. Steve already mentioned a couple. So again, this idea, nihilism, Netflix. You've heard of Netflix and chill. It's amazing. I gave a TED talk, and almost all the comments are, I don't think you know what Netflix and chill is. I make one joke about Netflix and freeze to death, and everyone's like, you don't get it. But again, this idea, as you've probably experienced during this little thing we call COVID, Netflix went through the roof, its stock went through the roof, because everyone was on Zoom meeting in one window and Stranger Things in another window. Again, data-driven activity. I don't know how many of you are wearing a Fitbit at the moment, but again, I'm fascinated by this idea that a thing on your wrist tells you, hey, jerk, get up, go for a walk, and you're just like, okay, I guess I got to do that now. Pleasure economics, again, this idea, Kickstarter, crowdfunding, GoFundMe, that I can flex my economic muscles to feel pleasure by basically exercising my power over others anywhere in the world. Herd networking, again, this idea of Facebook, that I just follow the crowd, do what they tell me to do, hate who they tell me to hate, which of course brings us to Twitter, where you just wake up in the morning and see who are we destroying today. But here's the optimism part. I'm getting to it. So are we forced to be resigned to nihilism? No. Simone de Beauvoir, famous French existential philosopher, tells us no. Unpredictability doesn't mean that we're at a loss. In fact, she argues that we should think in terms of ambiguity when we think about ethics, so that we can then realize that actually in unpredictable situations, we can still be ethical. We can even still be responsible. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. As she explains, when you're a kid, I'm assuming this happened to you. You were a child at some point. You like to do whatever you want, and you believe that you can do whatever you want. You can be free, because responsibility and things like that, well, that's for older people. So again, this idea that you're immune from danger as a child because that's the parent's job. That's the serious world, as she refers to it. But when we grow up, assuming any of you have, you come to realize that actually we do have personal responsibility. We do actually have, even as children, the decisions we've made already importantly shape who we are. So we were living in a fantasy world as children. We've always been responsible. That's always been the flip side of freedom. That's what existentialism means, that we are, as Sartre put it, condemned to be free. So this is the ambiguity that we first face in adolescence, this idea that I am free, but if I am truly free, that means I cannot actually justify any of my actions. So everything that we thought we could justify our behavior on, our parents, our traditions, our culture, what our parents told us, what our teachers told us, what now YouTube tells us, none of these things have any weight unless you give them weight. So you've probably experienced this before, that basically, as one famous philosopher put it, God is dead, but we keep bringing him back. So that was the first zombie movie. So again, this idea that, as de Beauvoir puts it, in the face of this ambiguity in adolescence, we're actually faced with multiple attitudes. Nihilism is just one of them. So I'm going to go through each of these. Just raise your hand if it applies to you, and we'll just figure out who's who, and you can just add it to your badge so we'll know for later. So first of all, the worst one, the subhuman. This is the person who is most afraid of their freedom, who just doesn't care about anything, but is able to hide their indifference by basically name-calling violence, attacking everyone else. So they're trying to fill in the void of caring with violence. And just for an example, even Trump thinks Boris is really the more subhuman. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. It's weird, I made these slides weeks ago, and yet the timing, it's perfect. So this brings us then to the serious individual. The serious person does not try to escape from their freedom, but instead tries to basically subsume or consume their freedom in projects. So you throw yourself into projects, especially those that have rules, that you know very clearly what to do and when to do it. You become fanatic about these projects because, of course, once the project is realized, you will find meaning in life. So who could this apply to? De Beauvoir tells us this is an engineer. Again, doesn't apply to any of you, I assume. The danger of seriousness is that, and maybe you have discovered this, that you are disappointed. You complete a project, you expect to be fulfilled, you're not. So what do? Next project. The problem is that also doesn't bring fulfillment. And at some point, you realize this whole process doesn't work, that there actually is no fulfillment. It's never going to happen. I don't care about any projects. I don't care about fulfillment. And ultimately, I don't care about the world, period. So, of course, our friend Elon. I can't think of anyone who has been more adept at finding projects to throw himself into and then throw away like garbage, which weirdly enough has resulted in him becoming the richest person on earth. And he doesn't care because we're all just living in a video game anyway. Now, if we start to move towards the ethical perspective, de Beauvoir finds in the adventurer a little bit of the ethical. They are willing to act. They act not because anyone else tells them to, but because they want to. They are indifferent towards their ends. They don't really care about what they're doing as long as they're acting. The problem is they're so in love with their own freedom that they don't actually care about the freedom of anybody else. So they're willing to use others as means to their own ends. I'm just going to keep finding CEOs until I find your boss. But again, this idea, you may be familiar with Bezos, how he spent COVID. Again, you were watching Netflix. He was building a space program to get off the Earth, and was kind enough to thank his employees for letting him use their money for these purposes. The passionate individual. This is, again, someone who they are obsessed with certain objects in life. They're objects of desire. They make the object desired by desiring it. They don't really care if nobody else likes it. They like it. Everything they pin their hopes on. And anything that gets in the way is basically something to be destroyed or something to be used. This brings us back to our friend Mark, who, of course, put this in probably the plainest terms possible. Just move fast and break things. I'm sure at least someone in here has a t-shirt with that saying on it. Now, the critic, this would be me, I guess, pursues fulfillment by life of the mind rather than life of the hand. They are importantly always claiming to be objective. They always take up this sort of bird's eye view, God's eye view. I'm just telling you how it is. This isn't me. This isn't my personal perspective. This is just the truth. And basically are unwilling to admit that they actually have a particular perspective and a particular view of truth. Maybe you've experienced this if anyone's ever tried to sell you Bitcoin or whatever favorite cryptocurrency you have right now in your virtual wallet. My apologies if you've been following the stock market with it. But again, this idea that the physical is dead, let's all live in the virtual. And then this brings us finally to the artist. The artist for de Beauvoir is the ethical individual. They are someone who is willing to act rather than merely contemplate like a critic. They are someone engaged in the world like an adventurer rather than removed from it. And importantly, they use the art to reveal the nature of existence. So it's through their work that we actually learn about the world and learn about what it means to be human. And of course, the best example I could think of for the most ethical CEO I could think of was Elizabeth Holmes. I don't know what you've heard, but I went into a coma in 2002, and I just remember all the headlines, all the cover of every magazine. But really, actually, this was a problem for me. I really couldn't find anyone to be a good example here. So again, feel free to raise your hand if you say, oh, no, that's me. So what can we learn from all this? How can we actually be ethical? So again, as we've seen, de Beauvoir makes this important argument. We can have an ethical attitude. We can, in the face of unpredictability, find ways to be responsible and ethical. The way to do it is to be an artist. This raises the important question for those of us in the room today. Could this apply to a tech company? Can a tech company be an artist? You didn't all jump up to say yes, so I'm a little worried. I don't care. So I'm not going to expect you to read all this, but I am a philosophy professor, so I do tend to make my students read all this. But again, she does have some important ideas about technology. She was writing 70 years ago, but again, I think her ideas still apply today. This idea that basically we're surrounded by technologies that give us these promises. They'll save us time, they'll make us more comfortable, they'll provide us luxury, they'll provide us happiness. Most importantly, what this sums up is that they'll make us feel better. They don't do it, so of course we just wait for the next technology with the next purpose. And she says what this reveals isn't that technologies are inherently bad. This doesn't reveal that technologies are inherently nihilistic, but instead we just have to change our sense of what technologies are supposed to do. So just to try to give you an idea of this long paragraph, again, the problem is that technologies give us a false promise. They promise us fulfillment. They're not going to do it. This is, again, as we already saw, this is the danger of seriousness, which leads to nihilism. I'm going to find fulfillment in the next thing, in the next project. That won't happen. Next one, next one, next one. Instead, she says, the key is to realize that if technologies, instead of promoting fantasies of fulfillment, promote freedom, if they promote freedom, then we actually can have a better life. And the way to do this, she says, is that if these technologies can help us to better understand the world, become more aware of the world, and importantly, open up concrete possibilities for action in the world, so that importantly, we reduce our complacency that this is just how things are, what else are we supposed to do? Basically everyone on British Twitter this morning. And again, this idea that it is through these ways that we can actually reduce oppression and promote freedom. So, important question. We've now discovered the way to be ethical is to promote freedom. But you might be thinking, if you've ever had an ethics class in your life, is that possible? Is that actually good? Can freedom be promoted? Can a promoted freedom really be freedom? Right? This is everyone's favorite thing, nudging. If you nudge someone to do something, does that mean they're free? Really? They're not manipulated? And most importantly, the problem of paternalism, well, what if people just want to enjoy things? What if people just want the promise of comfort, luxury, happiness, efficiency? Are we really the ones to tell them that's not the right thing to do, that they should want something better? So, more block quotes. Really, I just put these in for my coffee break. She tells us, yes, actually. Yes, freedom can be promoted. In fact, it must be promoted. And that this is, in fact, the only way that we can really become free. So importantly, we might think, well, that's not my job, that's someone else's job. And she says, you know, to stand back in the face of oppression is not to remain neutral, it's actually to be complicit. You're either helping people or you're hurting them by your inaction. And most importantly, this idea that actually promoting the freedom of others is promoting my own freedom. So again, you may have heard from people like John Stuart Mill, I'm just going to name check British philosophers for you, that freedom is basically a zero-sum game. That it's either my freedom or your freedom. Because the more freedom you have, the more that's going to invade my freedom. So I want my freedom and not your freedom. So everyone out for themselves. We've come up with a fun word for this, libertarianism. And she says, no, that's completely the wrong way to think about it. Freedom does not work that way. In fact, if I promote your freedom and you create new possibilities for action through your freedom, that expands my freedom, because now I have more possibilities. So it's actually the only way to improve my freedom is by improving the freedom of others. And for her, this is the most ethical thing we could do, really. So promoting the freedom of others is, even if we're just going to be selfish bastards, it's fine, because it's still, I have to promote your freedom to promote my freedom. Is a promoted freedom still freedom? Second coffee break. Yes. The key, of course, is that it's not if we should, but how should we do it? So again, this idea, it's very important to help others be free, but we also have to respect them at the same time, and we have to respect their freedom in the same way we would want them to respect our freedom. So we cannot be fascists. I know we might be living in countries that seem to think otherwise, but again, this idea, it's actually not a good thing to do to determine ends for other people. It's not a good thing to tell them this is the right thing, just do it, no matter what Nike thinks. We also should reject paternalism. We cannot prevent people from making their own mistakes. She reminds us again and again that science, art, they progress through mistakes. This is what it means to be scientific, to be artistic, to try new things, see what happens. If it doesn't work, I learned from the experience, I move on. So actually, she says, preventing people from making mistakes is essentially preventing them from being human. So it's very important to allow people to figure things out on their own. And in the end, we must give people reasons for making decisions. That's really what matters, rather than making decisions for them. So this is not an opt-out, but an opt-in kind of thing. And finally, as you've all seen memes on the internet, what if people just want to enjoy things? What do we do then? This is the one that I get criticized with the most. Are you really telling people to get off Netflix? Don't you have Netflix? Don't I see you on Twitter all the time? Yes, I'm happy to admit I'm as sick as the rest of you. So what do we do about it? Almost forgot my third coffee break. Well, she tells us very importantly, by reference to this play by Ibsen, I'm sure you're all familiar with, The Wild Duck, that we should not just beat people over the head with the truth, but instead try to find ways to make it so the truth is not painful to them. So if they've been living in illusions, you do not just hit them over the head with, nope, this is reality. Instead, you have to make it so that they find the truth for themselves. So most importantly, you can try to improve their situation so that having all their fun toys taken away from them doesn't feel painful, but instead feels liberating. I'm guessing if any of you are a parent, you've discovered this when you try to wrestle an iPad away from your child. There's clearly something your child is telling you if they're that attached to the iPad and willing to essentially knock you off the stairs in order to keep the iPad, right? There's something about their situation in the world where all they really want in life is an iPad, which again, it doesn't just babysit your child, it babysits you too. So you want the iPad to watch for yourself. So how do we then intervene? How can we justify intervention, especially if we said at the beginning we actually cannot justify our actions in terms of traditions, precedent, customs, culture, because again, all those things lead us back to seriousness. So how could we justify? Are we then, again, just left to relativism, that it's just up to each of us to justify whatever we want and it's okay because I justify it? She says, no, that's also not the truth. This is how existentialism is usually criticized. That's not her perspective. Instead, because freedom is who and what we are, we can always justify things by going back to freedom. So in other words, if we are acting to help people to become more free, then we might not be doing the best thing we could be doing, but at least it's not the worst thing we could be doing. So it gets us in the right direction. So again, this idea we have to try. We don't know if what we're doing is the right thing to do, and that's okay, because she says just like a scientist or an artist, again, you try, you fail, you try again, learn again. But very importantly, she says, you don't just try and see what happens. You also, in trying, try to make it the right thing to do. So it's not just sit back, see what happens. You don't just throw money into a charity, hope it works out. You actually have to be actively engaged and try to help real people in real situations. So, what do we do with all this? Where did we start? We started, of course, with nihilism. Where else could I start? But we tried to be more optimistic, as I was asked to do. And we asked the fun question, can tech companies be ethical? And we discovered, yes, even tech companies could be ethical if they just promote freedom. So what do we do? How do we do it? Well, I'm going to give you 3 tips. Again, promote the freedom of others in order to promote your own freedom. Respect the freedom of others as absolute. Don't make choices for them. Give them reasons to make the choices. And most importantly, improve the situations of others so that they embrace freedom rather than again escape into nihilism. So make the world a kind of place where your child would actually want to not be on an iPad, in other words. Or if that's too abstract for you, here are some don'ts. Don't exploit inequalities. Just because you can hire workers for below minimum wage doesn't mean you should. Don't exploit ignorance. So just because you know that they won't know it's bad, just because they won't know it's invading their privacy doesn't mean it's okay. And of course, don't exploit nihilistic tendencies. Just because you know they're willing to play a video game for 48 hours straight doesn't mean you should. So again, just because people are going to stare at pop-up ads and click here and click there doesn't mean that's okay either. Now I know what you're thinking, but how do you know if you're achieving more freedom? How do you know if you're respecting freedom? How do you know if you're improving situations? And this, of course, is the secret path back to nihilism and away from ethics, because then we feel comfortable, well, I'm never going to know. So either knowledge is impossible, or let an algorithm figure it out. And it's funny, she was writing 70 years ago, but she already saw that that was how we were going to go. And she's very clear, statistics are not going to help you here. So already 70 years ago, she was saying, we're talking about things that are incommensurable. So when trying to justify our actions mathematically, you have to reduce people to numbers, which again is already unethical. So it doesn't matter what outcome you achieve. Once you've reduced the world to data points, you've already done something so atrociously unethical that whatever you get out of that is already a problem. So what do we do instead? We become French existentialists. And we just have to sit with uncertainty and realize that's what it means to be moral. And most importantly, that it's good to keep asking questions. It's good to be humble and admit we don't actually know. So that's also the problem. We just assume we know the answers. I always tell my students I'm going to try to take any sentence that you end with a period and turn it into a question mark. And I think this is also what she would want us to do. Just keep asking questions, which of course leads us to the end of my talk. So, thank you. So how do we do this? Do I... Wow. Prophetic. All right. Questions? Yes.
Yes. The existentialist notion of freedom. I mean, you, of all people, know that was very problematic. There are many problems attached to that. You mentioned some of them, but could you elaborate? I mean, things like how a complex system of agents, where some people are forced to do something, they open up more possibilities for others, and the other way around, and how the complex interactions between freedom now leads to unfreedom later on, and so forth. All those, what do we do with them?
Yeah. Thanks. No, that's a good question. I had first been tempted to try to sneak a 3-hour talk into here, but I tried not to do it, so I'm cutting down. I'm on a PowerPoint diet. But yeah, I think she's writing this in 1948, so right after World War II, and she is trying to not say, well, we won, the Nazis are over, but instead look around and see, you know, the war isn't over, right? We're still fighting fascism. Even in France at that time, there's the French and Algerian War she's aware of. And what's interesting is she says, you know, it's even more complicated than we think, right? That there are all these people around the world who name themselves freedom fighters. And she says even in World War II, when we're talking about allies and Axis powers, there are freedom movements that you actually don't want to work because they would then destabilize your allies. And of course, this was Hitler's plan in the first place, and the only reason the US entered is because he tried to get Mexico to invade the US, and the US found out about it. So again, this idea, we have to pick our battles, and she says this means that sometimes you have to sacrifice your friends, and sometimes you even have to sacrifice yourself. So you have to have some sort of big picture idea of what is the best way to end oppression, what's the best way to realize freedom. But she says at the same time, it's very dangerous to keep pushing that off. And she says this is basically how we got to Stalinism. That because it all sounded good, we're going to achieve communist utopia, that we then just justified anything under that banner. And this is why she jumped off the Stalinist bandwagon. So it's very important to not just have freedom as an abstract quantity. She wants it to be as concrete as possible. And this is why she followed this up with the second sex, because she said even this was too ambiguous. We need to be more specific here. And this is why she looks at very specific situations. I know this is going to sound like a historic example, but making abortion illegal was something that she was very concerned about 70 years ago and what this would mean. And again, this idea that there are these very clear, concrete instances of people having their freedom taken away that we should engage in. So at the very least, if you cannot have some sort of big picture how to make all of humanity free, there are very specific instances and very specific problems that we can engage in. So I think at the very minimum, it would be to start there and work your way up. I hope that, well, I'm not going to say answers your question, but helps lead to better questions. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. She wants democracy, but she does not want an empty democracy. So it's very important for her. Voting is not enough, right? I know this is going to sound weird coming from an American, because all we ever tweet is vote. Vote more, vote harder. But again, the idea that, as Karl Marx made fun of America, they exercise freedom of speech once every 4 years. And that's less than half the population who even does that. But again, this idea that if we want democracy, we have to think about it again in concrete terms. So that really has to mean that everyone has a vote, everyone has an opinion, everyone has a perspective. This also brings us to someone like Hannah Arendt, who for her, it's very important. Politics should not be a dirty word. Politics shouldn't be something we want to get away from. Politics should instead, for Hannah Arendt, be what it means to be human. That again, this idea that politics is supposed to be, nobody has all the answers, nobody can see the whole truth, so we have to always come together to share our truth, share our perspectives, and then through that we build up a better view of the world. So it was very important for Hannah Arendt that we have to construct public spaces in the world where we can do this. And I think this is why it's so important. One of the big questions my students are always asking, are virtual platforms the public space that Arendt was imagining, right? So is Facebook the new public square? And I think we've kind of seen what happens when you do that, or when we try to do it on Zoom. So again, this idea, as I'm sure you've all experienced over the last couple of years, this is the talk I gave in Copenhagen the other day and why I'm still catching up on sleep. This idea that, even in the face of pandemic, even in the face of 1 million dead, just keep working, right? Just keep logging in and act like it's normal, right? And again, this idea for de Beauvoir and Hannah Arendt, we have to actually lean into our suffering. That's the only way to actually change things, right? Not just how can I feel less suffering, but always to ask, why am I suffering, right? What is the nature of reality such that I suffer? So it's important, Zoom was good and all, but it's still not the real thing, right? And this is why people, if they are going back to the office, and they're not, it's not to work, it's to socialize, right? It's to try to catch up on everything you miss on Zoom, which again, Hannah Arendt was very ahead of the times, because for her, what it means to be human is also to be spontaneous. And this is the exact thing we miss on Zoom meetings, right? If everything is scheduled, right, we're going to have a coffee break, and we're going to wear funny hats, and we're going to do it on Friday at 3, right? You can't fake spontaneity, right? It just doesn't work. But this is what it is to be a human being and not just a robot. So again, it's this idea that we actually have to come face to face. We actually have to talk to each other. We actually have to be democratic, that's what a democracy really is, right? If we're really going to go back to the ancient Greek model, then there really has to be an actual place where people actually come together and actually talk. And then you vote, right? It's not just I vote, I'm done, I'm out. So I don't know if that answers, but I hope. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a good question, and the one I struggled with most. So it is. I think to some extent helps us to understand the Elizabeth Holmes situation. So I didn't only put that up as a joke, but again, this idea that people were clearly clamoring for something like what she was offering. People were so desperate for a technology that just seemed unquestionably good, just something that will unquestionably help the world, right? Oh yes. So if you haven't watched the Hulu series yet, and I highly recommend it, or don't remember the aughts, Elizabeth Holmes, Stanford student, very inspired by Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, basically wanted to build this one black box, which we in ethics of technology are very amused by, because we always use a black box as an example of what technology should be, and then that's what she offered, a black box. And this idea that from one drop of blood, you could basically do every medical test you would want, right? So it would revolutionize healthcare. This is why President Obama was so enamored with it, because this was part of his healthcare strategy, right? To make everyone have access to healthcare. The only problem was the box didn't work. But she was really good at kind of like what I mentioned with Kickstarter, where people who've done research on Kickstarter have found that the most successful pitches on crowdfunding apps and platforms, it isn't about the idea, it's about the person behind it. So if you are a young, white, attractive woman, your project will tend to get funded. And so Elizabeth Holmes was able to talk a lot of rich white men into funding her. And because of their government influence, their military influence, she was able to get these big contracts and basically get regulators off of her back. Billions of dollars later, someone finally, a whistleblower, was able to get someone into the lab and realize there's a big nothing here. It just doesn't work. So she is, as far as I understand, still facing various lawsuits. I don't think she's actually in prison yet, but I think she has found a new life partner and is very inspirational on Instagram. But yeah, so I think it's this idea, right, that even the companies that seem ethical, is it a fantasy, right? Second Life would be an interesting example here, right? That this was something which initially I was very critical of because, again, this seemed like an escape from reality, so it seems nihilistic, right? I don't like the real world, I'm going to make up a new one. But what's interesting is Second Life kind of disappeared because, again, everyone tried to find better ways, virtual reality ways, the metaverse ways to make new worlds, or like Bezos, just go find a new one. But the Second Life community has actually stayed pretty strong, especially in the disability world. So it's very important. They didn't just shut it down when their profits went down. They kept it going. And what's interesting is the original CEO and founder of Second Life went off into, I'm going to make VR, I'm going to find all these new things. They all failed miserably, and now he's going on the speaking circuit to tell you why metaverse is not a good idea. And he's gone back to Second Life. Because again, it's this idea of maybe we shouldn't say, this works, can we scale it up? But just say, no, it works. Just leave it there. Don't try to become the next biggest thing on the planet. Don't try to become Zuckerberg, but just, right, be happy with it. Again, very similar with Facebook, right? Facebook evolved to an unregulatable, too big to fail situation. And this is why those of us who got in the early days, it's always kind of this confusing thing where you can name all of the important things in your life that you've been able to do through Facebook. So you become a Facebook evangelist, right? I was able to get job opportunities. I was able to stay in touch. I was able to see pictures. I saw people. And then you hear about the Cambridge Analytica stuff, and you're like, oh, well, that's the bad Facebook. I'm on the good Facebook, right? But again, I think it's important that this is why she says not an ethical person, but an attitude. That it's something you have to struggle with, as I said at the end here, and you have to be vigilant about. So I think this is also the danger, right? That if you do a good thing, that doesn't make you a good person, right? So a tech company that produces a good product, you're not a good tech company. You have to stay ethical. You have to stay with that attitude. You have to keep fighting that attitude. You have to keep asking questions, right? So just because you got regulators to approve it, but you know they shouldn't have approved it, because this is one of my favorite things being on a tech ethics board. When you see this weird relief when you say they're approved, and they're like, really? Wow. Well, that wasn't good. So yeah, I think it's always important. I was brought to Rome. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. That's how you know it's always really a good ethical company. And it was interesting because they wanted me to teach them about privacy. And so I was doing it, and they were all kind of smirking and laughing to each other. And finally I said, what is it? Is it something I'm wearing? Is it something I'm saying? And they're like, no. It's just you're talking about how to design something for privacy, but we already designed it. And I said, well, then why am I here? And they said, well, the funding required we have a privacy workshop. It just didn't say when. So I was brought in somewhere between we're finished and we're launching to teach them how they should have done it in the first place. And the best part was all the people who were like, wow, I wish we knew that, because we totally did not make this. I always wonder what happened to them. But yeah, I think that's the key, right? Is that it's better to be worried than to be confident at the very least. Yeah.
As someone who struggles with how much screen time my children have,
Yeah.
when I take the iPad away from my children and they can play, should I say, thank me for promoting your freedom?
Well, yeah.
What should I do when they say, I don't want you to stay from my children?
Yeah, this is the conversation I have with my son. It's interesting. I remember giving a talk in Dublin at Google, and then going out for drinks after, and all the people from Facebook and YouTube were at the bar getting really drunk, just drunk enough to finally tell me what they're really working on. Not the Googlers. They could hold their liquor, but the YouTube guys, they were just. I mean, they were. I've seen some things, right? It was a real apocalypse now kind of situation. And this one YouTuber basically said to me, do you have a son? And I said yes. And he said, does he ever look at YouTube? And I said, no, we have YouTube for kids. And he was like, no, that's get it off. He was like, you have no idea how bad it is. So yeah, I think it is important when we talk about paternalism. It is always this interesting thing. So for John Stuart Mill, to make it more British again, he wanted to have it both ways, right? That you had to be, as a utilitarian, you had to be educated in how to want the greatest good for the greatest number. At the same time, as a libertarian, you never tell people what to do. You can only interfere with people's freedom to the extent that they are harming other people's freedom. This, of course, creates a contradiction. His get-out-of-jail-free card was to say, we're utilitarian when they're children, and then libertarian when they're adults. So you can be a paternalist when you're a parent, and then as soon as they hit 18, they're hit with that magic beam of adulthood, and you back off, and I've never invaded your freedom, go be you, right? Live your truth. Even though for 18 years I've been denying it. So again, I think it is important that it is a struggle, right? And I try to talk with my son while wrestling the iPad away, because it is interesting that he'll watch these videos that have these horrible, disgusting monsters that he knows gives him nightmares. And I find it fascinating that YouTube kids can hide it from the algorithm by putting them in things like how to draw. So if you're just looking at how to draw videos, they can show you whatever you want to draw, right? So he knows all about xenomorphs and Predator and things I'm always confused when he's asking me over breakfast. Like, how do you know these things? He's like, oh, from how to draw. So again, it's important, one, not to trust the algorithm to raise your children. But two, I think, they're going to want to see things they shouldn't see. This is something that Plato was already talking about, sort of how your eyes want to see things the rest of you doesn't. And you really, you're desperate to look away, but you can't. So we cannot just trust children to do the right thing. But at the same time, you can hopefully point out to them that never sleeping, always having the light on, needing an escort to and from your room at all times, this isn't probably the best way to live just to see a xenomorph. So yeah, I think he's getting it, but it's been a multi-year struggle. And of course, whenever he goes to another kid's home, free for all, who knows what they're watching. But yeah, I think this is the idea, right? Is that you want to get work done, especially now that we're at home. So you can't have your child in your room, so you put them on a screen. So Daddy's on his screen, you be on your screen. And I think this is dangerous, and we have to figure out how to not do that. And at the same time, at the very least, just locking in a room isn't the worst thing we could do. Yeah.
Just to expand that point, paternalism. There are
Yeah, good. Yeah, she discusses those actual very specifically as cases later in the book. And she says, you know, there's someone with substance abuse problems. They're begging you for money. They're begging you for drugs. You want to help them. And she says, again, this has to be a concrete, not a vague, empty principle, right? So she says the doctor who just keeps them alive is not their liberator, but their torturer. And so I think at the same time, there has to be an understanding of, you know, what are they really going through? Why are they so desperate for drugs? If it's just addiction, we can treat addiction. But if it's something more than that, then again, just taking the drugs away from them isn't going to help, right? They will find other means, right? And you have to take seriously this idea that, again, you know, when we talk about suicide as a cry for help, to take that seriously, right? And you're never going to see all the warning signs, but I think it's very important for de Beauvoir to try to figure out what's actually the best way to help this person in this situation, right? And again, to never just say no drugs, no alcohol, no, you cannot apply across the board. No, you have to look at each case, and so again, you have to. You know, you give a sandwich to a homeless person. Did that help them? It kept them alive a little bit longer, but they're still on the street, right? So again, you have to think about, like I said earlier, about how to improve the world so that they're not living on the streets, they're not driven to drugs, right? My undergraduate thesis was on boredom, because I, you know, write what you know. And for me, it was very important, this idea that if you're bored, and maybe you are now, that this is you know, your body telling you something, right? And again, this idea, this is also why it's dangerous, our digital fantasies of evading the body. The body is really good at telling you things you need to hear, right? So escaping from your body is also escaping from all this information that you need to know. And I think it is important that if you're desperately bored, it's not just you, right? In Eindhoven in the Netherlands, we've become really good with smart lighting solutions. Maybe it's come to a company near you to make workers feel better and more productive, just by enhancing the lighting in their offices. And I see some of your bosses writing this down right now. But again, this idea that we have the research possibility to use something as simple as lighting to affect your mood and to make you feel better. And because we say this should make you feel better, if it doesn't, then it always falls back to you, right? Science says this should help you. If it doesn't help you, then you're the problem, right? And this is also a great way for your boss to say, well, everyone else is happy. I don't know why you're not happy. It's you, right? So I think it's important, again, this idea that we have to be willing to entertain, and this is what de Beauvoir and Arendt were so focused on, was that there's something wrong with the world that leads to suffering. And that just fixing yourself is, again, how to be complacent to make the world worse, not to make the world better. Because that doesn't do anything for anyone else. It just might make you feel a little better. So I hope that helps. Yeah? Yeah, that's a good question. I think at that point, environmentalism was not the biggest concern. She wrote about it later. But I think, again, this idea that humans are who we are through our surroundings, right? So not just our technological surroundings, but natural surroundings. So again, that even if we want to be selfish about it, making the world a better place is also making nature a better place, right? So that we live as beings on this planet. We're part of the planet. And yeah, so I think it's always this danger that if we too instrumentalize nature, and this is why I get very worried about a lot of sustainability campaigns that say, you know, save the planet for us and never save the planet for the planet. Then again, it seems like, well, people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are saying, well, I'll just find another planet. Then if it's a planet for me, it doesn't have to be this one. Just find another one. Or it could be a virtual planet in the metaverse, right? That's Zuckerberg's space program. So yeah, I think it's very important to take seriously, like Arthur Schopenhauer, for example, said, you know, humans are the blight on the planet. So if we really wanted to save the planet, we should just leave. We don't have to go that far. But I do think it's important to realize, and this is actually something that Simone de Beauvoir and someone like Herbert Marcuse talked about in relationship actually to things like birth control. That this is actually one of the ways that we help the planet is by not overpopulating it. So again, this realization that all of these things are connected, right? That environmentalism and theocratic fascism are not in line with each other. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I remember a talk a few years ago in Leiden that was about, you know, it started with these silicon chips and, you know, these revolutionary things they could do to help people, but then moved backwards to, but where does silicon actually come from? And then started showing mining projects in Nigeria and all the people who died to you know, basically all the parts of the iPhone, and how they came from all of these horrible deprived places so that you could get the iPhone cheaper than you had to basically be willing to murder all these people you're never going to see, right? So again, this idea that you might not be employing slave labor, but you might be holding something in your hand that does, right? So how do you reconcile these things, right? And it's interesting, I think it's important for de Beauvoir, again, to take these things seriously, to not just brush them off and to not just say, well, everyone else is doing it, so it must be fine, right? Does that mean that we just stop mining projects altogether? Because this is also how we get paternalistic, right? We say, well, if we weren't doing mining, think about all the people who wouldn't have jobs in all these countries, right? But again, it's not a job if they have to do it or die, and they're likely to die anyway on the job. So at the very least, as I said earlier, we don't have to exploit inequalities. We can't actually pay people what they're owed. So it's always very important to think about that if companies are celebrating their massive profits, this is money that actually could have gone to the people who needed it. They don't have to go to you. So I think that might be one approach at least. All right, I think that's it. Thank you.